This first session is called Setting the Scene, and the aim is to try and provide you with some of the essential background information that really needs to be taken into account by anyone who is considering any sort of plans to stock salmon into river systems. We've got 3 papers, and they're going to address the reasons that we might want the reasons we might want to stock salmon, how salmon populations work and how stocking interacts with the way that salmon populations work, and also the importance of genetics in making some of these decisions. We have 3 speakers who I'm sure will require little need for introduction for many of you. And our first speaker is David Salmon. David was a colleague of mine about 30 years ago, working for the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, but since that time he's been an independent consultant with particular expertise on everything to do with salmon, including catching them on rod and line, I think. David is going to introduce us to the reasons that we might think about stocking. David.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm not really sure why I was asked to give this introductory talk today. I'm not a geneticist, and I've never managed a hatchery program, but I guess I'm just a boy that can't say no, so I'll do my best to provide a useful overview of why stocking is undertaken, and in doing so, throw out 1 or 2 challenging issues. Now, last evening I dined with several colleagues, including Phil McGinnity. I warned him that I might throw out 1 or 2 challenges to my geneticist friends, to which he responded, "What friends?" Now, I do hope he was joking, but it does highlight the fact that there are many unresolved arguments in this business. So, why stock? Many of the calls for restocking programs are based upon a perception, rightly or wrongly, that things ain't what they used to be, in the words of the song. Tales abound of rivers teeming with salmon, huge catches, and fish so abundant that they were fed to pigs and even, heaven forbid, apprentices. The feeling that is that the depleted stocks that remain are dwindling fast and incapable of recovering without help from hatcheries. The angling press has often carried letters and articles accusing the powers that be of intransigence, incompetence, laziness and indifference, and even of the politics of ethnic cleansing in their astonishing reluctance to implement widespread hatchery restocking. This, in my view, is an extreme and mistaken view. Now, there have at times been more salmon in many of our rivers than there are at present, but by and large, stocks are very resilient and generally well managed. There are probably salmon spawning in more rivers in the UK now than there have been at any time in the past 200 years. And of course, stocking programs have played a part in achieving this. But stocking isn't a universal panacea. It's just one tool available to the fishery manager. And like all tools, it's right for some situations and inappropriate for others. However, I don't think that overstatement of the case is restricted to those calling for hatcheries. As a response to the less justified proposals, there has often been a tendency for fisheries scientists to resist pressure for all hatchery programs, which in my view is an overreaction. I maintain that spurious arguments have in fact been used on both sides of the argument. One suggestion, for example, is that a successful hatchery program will lead to increased net fishing to the detriment of the wild stock in the river there and also neighbouring wild stocks. Now, while this may be the case, as indeed it may be for any other good management program that leads to increased stocks, I cannot accept that a good way to manage net fisheries is to maintain all stocks at such a low level that netting is in fact uneconomic. It is not a progressive view. And my particular pet hate is the term extinction vortex. And I hope Phil McGinnity lives to regret ever coining the wretched phrase. This is a dire warning meted out to those who tinker with salmon genetics, rather akin to the Strahl-Peter stories which are told to naughty children. I look forward to some very lively discussion on this and other matters over the next couple of days, but I suspect that complete resolution of many of these arguments is too much to hope for. Now, if we look beyond the cry that something must be done, there are many reasons why fisheries managers and anglers may wish to stock rivers with salmon. These reasons range from well-founded and justified, through rather woolly and of uncertain justification, to downright wrong-headed and potentially damaging. So what I would like to do in the next few minutes is to tease out the various types of restocking programs and briefly discuss the validity of arguments for and against. The first argument for restocking is because there is currently no salmon in the catchment and I would like there to be. Now this may be at first sight one of the simplest situations which justifies a restocking programme. But even here there are complications. Why are there no salmon? If there never have been salmon, there is probably a very good reason, such as a lack of suitable spawning and rearing area or natural impassable falls. If this is the case, then any restocking programme may be restricted to ranching, with hatchery production permanently bypassing the limiting factor in the life cycle. In other cases, the river may have lost its original stock through such issues as pollution, creation of obstructions such as weirs and dams, or canalisation of the river and dredging. Creation of a new salmon run is a laudable aim in such situations, as long as one is sure that the limiting factors have been or can be removed or bypassed. This may be a monumental task. For example, on many rivers which had lost their salmon due to pollution, mill dams and weirs were constructed without thought of fish passage requirements. In the case of the River Taff in South Wales, which has a successful salmon rehabilitation programme on it right now, following great improvements in water quality, providing fish passes on the lowermost 4 weirs on the main river have recently cost in excess of £2.5 million. And in the case of the River Thames, the subject of a rather less successful rehabilitation programme recently, most of the historic spawning and nursery grounds were drowned out by the construction of weirs and navigation locks. And this is a problem for which there appears to be no realistic solution. In spite of this, of course, there are numerous cases of former salmon rivers which have been brought back from the dead by rehabilitation programmes. Examples include the Taff, Neath and Towey in South Wales, the Tyne in North East England, the Lagan in Northern Ireland and the Clyde in Scotland. But even in these cases there is uncertainty regarding the exact role that restocking has played, with many of the recolonising fish proving to be strays from neighbouring rivers. Now, this is a very interesting situation which I'm sure will crop up a number of times in this conference, and I will certainly be returning to it in a few minutes. Second reason for considering restocking. Put simply, there are not as many salmon as there could be in the catchment, and I would like there to be more. In such situations, many anglers and fishery managers would like to help the stock to fully exploit the potential production. Again, the first step must be to identify and remedy the limiting factors, be they water quality issues, obstructions, habitat degradation, or overexploitation. Often curing the limiting factor will allow natural regeneration. Look after the environment and let the fish do the rest. Perhaps the most justified restocking in such situations would be the restocking of areas of catchment that are lacking fish to facilitate and speed up recolonisation. Perhaps the commonest and most justifiable case for many restocking programmes is that some human influence, for example an impassable dam, is limiting production, and I'm required to mitigate for this. Such situations as hydroelectric dams and water resource dams. There are many such mitigation programs throughout the British Isles and Scandinavia, and they are effectively a permanent commitment. In most situations where spawning and rearing grounds have been isolated or destroyed, stocking with smolts is the only realistic option. Effectively a ranching program and a commitment permanently. There is nowhere for the fish thus produced to spawn, and they thus make no real contribution to the natural stock, and indeed the genetic manipulations involved may represent some level of threat to the natural stock if they interbreed. The main justification will be to maintain levels of adult stock for angling and commercial fisheries, but there's nothing wrong with that. Now, there are situations where mitigation can be better integrated with natural production. There may be areas upstream of impassable barriers which can be restocked with eggs, fry or parr to allow utilisation of the natural production potential. Getting the downstream migrants to successfully negotiate to negotiate the barrier may be difficult, may be a challenge, but there are a number of successful programmes of this type, for example, that at the Spey Dam in the upper reaches of the River Spey in Scotland. Perhaps less obvious is the scope for restocking below impoundments, where the modified flow regime has resulted in lost or reduced production. Example of a situation where this may be justified is that of Colliford Reservoir in the catchment of the River Foy in Cornwall. The Foy is a productive small catchment, and before the reservoir was built on the St Neot River, the tributary, about 6 kilometres above the confluence with the main river, the lower 4 kilometres was good salmon spawning and production. Now, although the great majority of the impounded flow still comes down the St Neot River and into the Foy, the flow regime is greatly modified, and in particular there's been the virtual eradication of the peak flows which were formerly associated with spawning salmon penetrating and spawning in the stream. This picture shows the densities of salmon at a number of sites between the village of St Neot, a little over 4 kilometres from the confluence, down to Pengelly Bridge, a few hundred metres above the confluence, before, in blue, and after, in yellow, impoundment. And the pattern of decline is very clear. In particular, spawning and rearing has been virtually eradicated from the top half of this area formerly used, and greatly reduced in the lowermost areas. Now, the stream remains a potentially highly productive nursery area. It has very good stocks of trout in it. It's a very attractive stream, as can be seen here. Ideal juvenile salmon habitat, but the adult fish just don't get there to spawn. Due to the water resource management regime, the dam very rarely overtops. It didn't spill at all for the 7-year period from May 2001 to November 2008. And as provision of reservoir releases to encourage adult migration and spawning is likely both to be prohibitively expensive in terms of stored water and indeed in uncertain effectiveness, restocking might be a viable alternative in this case. There's already a small hatchery program run by enthusiastic fishery interests on the Foy, and I suggest that an ideal solution to a range of challenges would be to encourage and direct their efforts with appropriate guidance and discipline to the St Neot River and get it producing juvenile salmon again. The fourth answer to why stock, put simply, I wish to enhance certain traits or bring some new genetic material into the stock, for example, to improve runs of spring fish. Although it's not been the main justification for the action, it's been claimed, I would suggest without any real evidence, that the use of Rhine fish to restock the Wye in the 19th century and Scottish material put into the River Exe in the early 20th century were responsible for great improvements in the spring runs of these two rivers. It may or may not be the case. There's clearly justification for the belief that sea age at return, and thus in turn the seasonal timing of entry to the river, is indeed largely under genetic control. And there are a number of programs involving hatchery production of fish from native multi-sea winter adults in the hope of boosting returns of such fish. Now, while this may be a worthy aim, such manipulations may be fraught with danger. The fact remains that many such programs are run and many people consider them entirely justified, and this is going to be a very interesting area for further discussion, I think. The fifth reason for restocking, a very interesting one, and in my view, one of the most honest and justifiable, though equally one of the most contentious. I wish to produce salmon for anglers to catch, ranching, effectively. Two very well-known and successful programs on the Bundora River at Delphi in Ireland and on the Ranga River in Iceland are subjects for specific papers later in this conference. The main risks involved are the likelihood that some of the ranched fish may spawn with native stocks in the river where the program is taking place, or in neighbouring rivers to which they stray. Now, perhaps the more the ranch stock is domesticated, the greater the risk that hybrids with wild fish will be unsuitable for the environment and pose some sort of threat to the genetic integrity of the stock, but also the lower the risk that such successful breeding will actually take place. Rainbow trout have effectively lost the ability to reproduce in the wild in the UK within a few generations of domestication. The few naturally breeding stocks arose from very early introductions of non-domesticated strains. Perhaps we should be exploring and encouraging such a possibility with salmon. Fish which will not interbreed at all with the wild stocks and are thus limited in their impact to the immediate one of just being there. And if at any time one decides this is not a good idea, you stop and the problem goes away. Sadly, the use of triploids would not appear to be suitable in this case because triploids appear to lose the will to return to fresh water and, like the Flying Dutchman, are doomed to sail the seven seas forever. But we still don't know how great a risk interbreeding between wild and ranch salmon, or indeed farm escapees, actually is. A major investigation at the Salmon Research Agency at Barashul some years ago presented evidence of a mechanism of potential harm, but I have what I think are valid challenges to a number of the conclusions drawn, and I look forward to discussing this with Phil later on in this meeting. This work was the origin of that expression, extinction vortex. Some evidence of the lack of such an effect comes from what's gone on at Delphi. Now, Delphi effectively lost most of its sea trout run in the late 1980s, and in an attempt to provide silverfish for anglers to catch, a major ranching program was introduced. This graph shows in the darker colour the catch of wild salmon, rod catch of wild salmon over the years, and the paler colour is the rod catch of ranch salmon superimposed on that. Now, I feel that the catch of wild fish is remarkably stable. In fact, statistically, there is a slight upward trend in it, and certainly no evidence of the extinction vortex. Now, the impact may be hidden in there, and perhaps a hidden extinction vortex is a scarier proposition than one that's more obvious. But again, we can argue about this later. But there's a way in which ranching can actually help the wild stocks by providing fish for anglers to keep while requesting or requiring them to release all wild fish unharmed. This does, of course, require that ranched and wild fish are readily differentiated, but this should in any case be required in most restocking programs. When I've occasionally fished at Delphi in the past, I was always delighted to realise that the fish I had hooked had a missing adipose fin and was thus of ranched origin, like this one here, which meant not only could I keep and kill it, I had to do so. By adopting such a policy, Delphi achieved a very high level of catch and release of wild fish, many years ahead of most other fisheries and areas. Many rivers now operate a no-kill policy, of course, for wild salmon, but provision of some ranch stock might represent the only opportunity to retain a captured fish. Now, there are, of course, strong arguments for allowing recovering rivers to repopulate naturally, and I'm sure Jamie Stevens will be presenting a very clear case for this later in the meeting. But even here, hatchery production may in fact have a role. There's strong circumstantial evidence that straying salmon are attracted to rivers already containing other salmon. One of the first papers I ever published in the journal Nature, more than 40 years ago, I'm ashamed to admit now, presented evidence of such pheromone influence on the migration of salmon. So, is there the possibility of using stocked salmon as decoys to attract strays to repopulate the river? It's an interesting possibility. Some of the evidence of how this operates, this is one of the diagrams, in fact, from that Nature paper 40 years ago. This shows the estuary catch by dip nets and picked up dead and capture in puts and putches and things like that on the estuary of the River Parrett in Somerset between 1950 and about 1970. Now, this was not a salmon river at the time, and there had always been quite an active fishery for all sorts of species in the estuary, which was a bycatch caught small numbers of salmon returning to the Usk, Wye and Severn in particular. Now, immediately following a restocking programme on the River Tone, tributary of the Parrett, there was a great increase in the incidental catch on the River Parrett. And this higher level of catch, several times higher than it had been before, was maintained throughout the years of stocking and for several years afterwards, where there was evidence of a low level of natural spawning. The moment that spawning petered out, the incidental catch fell back to zero. Now, it was clear that most of these fish were not generated from the River Parrett or River Tone. There were far too many of them, the response was too quick, and many of them bore tags from a programme on the Usk, Wye and Severn, which was running at the time, in about the right proportions for pretty much the whole of that catch to be of Usk, Wye and Severn fish. But it does indicate that the estuary and lower reaches of the river were rendered more attractive to salmon which were looking for the way home and exploring and possibly even straying by virtue of the presence of these young salmon. So, could we use salmon as decoys? It wouldn't even require the fish to be released. Just having a hatchery in the catchment might work, and if you were really worried about the genetic effects, you could even kill the fish rather than release them, or send them somewhere else for some other purpose. But it is an interesting possibility, and it does help to explain some of the results which have been obtained in various programs elsewhere. Now, this might not be an exhaustive list of the reasons for restocking, but I hope it serves to illustrate the wide range of situations in which it might be considered and some of the issues which are raised by the various arguments for stocking. Perhaps the clearest message, though, which should be taken from what I'm saying, is the requirement for clarity itself. And I suggest here 4 steps that need to be taken for any programme before a decision is taken. There are many, many other decisions to be taken later on, but these, I think, are first and foremost. And Melfort touched on this too. There is a very clear need. There's a clear need for a clear statement of the problem. What is it you're trying to do, and why is this the way to do it? Then clear, defined objectives for the programme that are rational, achievable, proportionate and acceptable. And then an incisive assessment of the limiting factors that are presently preventing the desired situation from prevailing. And finally, a statement as to how and to what extent the proposed actions will remove or bypass these limiting factors. And I think adherence to these questions will prevent many ill-advised and inappropriate programmes and head them off before they really get going. One last thought is something I touched on earlier, that many ranching programs are producing fish for people to catch, and I think there's nothing at all wrong with that. We must recognise that fisheries management for the enhancement of angling is an entirely justifiable end in itself. We are all here because the salmon here today because the salmon is an important and valuable sport species. Where, for example, are the sellout meetings on genetics of bullheads and shad? They're not there. It's salmon that attracts the attention, and entirely because of its value as a sport species. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. We have time for one or two questions now, and then there will be a wash-up session after the three papers. So any questions directly to David on his presentation there? Perhaps I could start with one. David, I know, it wasn't directly related to your presentation, but in your last slide it occurred to me that you didn't make any mention of evaluating the project after you had done it. Now, I can see why you didn't, because you're trying to make the decision about whether you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. But what would your comments be on that?
When I started writing that list, it got to 30 points, and I thought, no, A, I haven't got time to say all this, and B, it isn't really relevant to why we restock, so I limited it to that. But you're absolutely right, and I did make reference once or twice to the need to be able to evaluate what you're doing, which means some way of identifying your fish and knowing what worked and what didn't and so on. And indeed, this is even more important if I'm right about the strays suggestion, which are attracted. You may get quite a good effect of a restocking programme, but you need to know whether those fish are really ones you generated or ones you've attracted from elsewhere.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, here.
David, you mentioned the cost of the fish passage work on the tap, $2.5 million. Now, that's probably going to last for 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
It costs them per year. It's not very much. But $2.5 million is about the cost of the hatchery that fed it for about 10 years. And so we don't conceive that the permanent solution is probably better and more economic one than the temporary one.
I think both have their place in the right place, but you're absolutely right. And when I, in fact, got those figures from Pete Goff last week, he said, and cheap at half the price, or twice the price, or whatever. And I'm sure that's dead right. That £2.5 million in terms of what it is doing to regenerate that river and giving it the opportunity to become self-sustaining is a small price to pay, but it nevertheless takes some raising. There's only one person I know who can readily raise that sort of money, and that's you.
Any other questions? Yes, back. Could you just introduce yourself?
I think, David, you said you provide an example of spray down, example of good fish passage. That's not been in our own view. Our evidence from Red Count shows that when spray down was closed in 1943, Red Count collapsed from 250 to 4 within 20 years. And the superintendent at the time stated this was a disaster area of the spray. It's pretty much like that now. And we reckon smoke production is in order of 10% of its potential. We'd just like to add that.
Okay, so that, there really is considerable unused potential rearing in that area. Maybe it needs a bigger stocking programme, or a better way of getting more adult fish past to spawn naturally. I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, then. Well, thank you very much, David. David has already demonstrated that the first three talks are very closely integrated. He's been talking about salmon population dynamics and genetics, and so I think probably we're going to have it's the discussion at the end which is going to be most important, I think.